Okay, well, good evening, everybody. What a pleasure to see you all. We should start out by saying Happy New Year, or as you say in Japanese, is Akemashite omedetou gozaimasu. And Kotoshi mo douzo yoroshiku onegaishimasu. So very much hoping to see a lot of you over the coming year. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Simon Kaner. I'm the Executive Director of the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures. And it's always lovely to be here in the Cathedral Hostelry and to be doing an in-person third Thursday lecture to kick off the new year is a particular pleasure for us. I want to say hello to everybody online as well. I gather we have a big global audience beaming in this evening. I have to say you're not missing much in terms of Norwich weather today because it is pretty horrible out there. So I hope you're nice and dry and warm wherever you are. So it's 2026, year of the horse, or year of the fire horse, which is all a bit ominous in terms of its omens for a Japanese context anyway. But we've got some fun things coming up, including in May, we've got a major conference which we're planning at the moment in memory of Professor Toshio Watanabe, who some of you will remember, our professor of Japanese arts and cultural heritage. And that will be in London on the 15th and 16th of May. So pop that in your diaries. And a couple of days before that, on the 13th of May, we're going to have the next in our annual series of Robert Sainsbury lectures, and that'll be up at the university. This is the one thing that we do with our colleagues in the Sainsbury Centre and the Sainsbury Research Unit for the Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. And this year we have a rather wonderful speaker. Well, they've all been wonderful speakers, but in that fine tradition of wonder, we have the chief curator of the National Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo. Mr. Suzuki Katsuo is coming over especially to talk to us. So that will be a nice event on the 13th of May, as I say, a bit additional to our normal third Thursday programs. And we've been talking about that today, and we've got an exciting program to roll out for you over the coming year. So it's a particular pleasure this evening to welcome Professor Oleg Benesch back to Norwich. I know that Oleg's been here on a number of occasions, and we're all very excited because a little later this month, the British Museum will open their blockbuster exhibition on samurai, which we're all expecting is going to be hugely popular and hugely interesting, as well as hopefully hugely provocative. Oleg has been working with the head of the Japanese section at the British Museum, Rosina Buckland, over the last few years, putting this exhibition together. And I'm really delighted that you were able to come down and talk to us on samurai, knights, and nationalisms and the Middle Ages in modern Japan. Oleg is the professor of history at the University of York, and he's head of the department of history. They were just telling me that involves 400 members of staff, seemingly, and 1,000 students. So sort of managing that lot is quite a handful, I should imagine. And thank you very much indeed for finding time, or maybe it made a nice excuse to get away at the beginning of the year. Oleg was very much involved in the book, which is accompanying the exhibition on the samurai, called Samurai, and that will be out very shortly. I'm guessing if it's not already. It's already at your favorite bookshop, I should imagine. So do go and get a copy of that if you can. We know Oleg because he's written extensively on Japanese history. One of my favorite books is his work on Japanese castles, looking at the afterlife of medieval Japanese castles, I suppose. That's the book, Japanese Castles, Citadels of Modernity in War and Peace. We went into the Norwich Castle this afternoon to have a look at the afterlife of a particularly fine example, a medieval Japanese castle, and that was a nice few minutes to be able to spend in there. But he's also published on civilizing emotions, concepts in 19th century Asia and Europe, and drugs and the politics of consumption in Japan. So wide-ranging set of interests there. So the structure for this evening is as normal. Oleg will speak for about 50 minutes, and we hope we'll have time for some Q&A after that. And those of you online, you'll see there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen in Zoom, and you can just type in your questions there at any point in the evening, and we'll try and get to as many of those as we possibly can in the Q&A session. And for those of you in the room with us, we'll have a roving mic, and we do ask you to use the mic so that everybody online as well can hear the questions as well as the answers. And the wonderful Olivia has asked me to point out that we are experimenting with a new system this evening. So we're hoping to all of you out there that you can hear and see everything. And if you have any problems, do put things in the chat and we can try and attend to those in the course of the presentation. So without any further ado, I'm going to invite Professor Oleg Benesch to come and talk to us on samurai. Oleg, over to you.
Thank you so much, Simon, and yeah, thank you so much to especially Olivia and Laura for arranging my visit. It's wonderful to be back down here. Yeah, I think it's the first time since 2018 that I've been down in Norwich, so great to see old friends as well, and to see the new Norwich Castle, which is fascinating. And castles will feature fairly prominently in my talk today, which in which I'm going to focus on various aspects of martial culture. Material culture, including buildings, to discuss what I call kind of the medievalization of modern Japan. And although I'm primarily a historian of East Asia, I'm going to begin this talk in this hemisphere. And in the 19th century, Europeans rediscovered and reinvented the Middle Ages on a grand scale. Medievalist symbols and ideals were widely invoked as a response to industrialization and the Enlightenment. They fed into art, architecture, literature, and culture, from the knightly tales of Sir Walter Scott to the proliferation of what is often called Gothic architecture. Colonial officials, soldiers, and settlers saw themselves as modern heirs of medieval knighthood, spreading Christianity and civilization as part of their perceived imperial mission. Medieval symbols and narratives were eagerly taken up in European settler societies, including the United States, Australia, and Latin America. And one of the key concepts I'm going to be using today is medievalism. And following many other scholars, I use this term, medievalism, to refer to the use of medieval symbols and ideals after the Middle Ages have ended. So in other words, how the medieval has been reimagined and recreated in subsequent centuries, especially in the last 200 years. And medievalism, or kind of medievalism studies, has become a major research field since the early 20th century. And there have been countless books and articles, and there's dedicated academic journals. And in this field, this term medievalism is typically used to refer to uses of the medieval past and medieval symbols, again, usually from the 19th century onward. And I should note here that the Middle Ages in question here are usually European. And I'll return to this concept of medievalism a bit later, but this is just kind of a brief overview of some of the common, what I had there a second ago was kind of the most common use of the term by scholars in the field. And in Europe, the medieval period has long been a subject of academic scholarship. It's been a source of popular aesthetic, cultural, and spiritual ideals since probably the late 18th century. In the 19th century, this interest in an idealized medieval past grew rapidly with the proliferation of nationalist sentiment and the formation of new nation states. We can see here the fortress of Carcassonne, which was a medieval ruin before being rebuilt under the direction of the famous architect Viollet-le-Duc in the early 19th century. Viollet-le-Duc was also responsible for the redesign and enhancement of Notre Dame in Paris, which is perhaps most obvious in the spire that he added to the cathedral and which collapsed in the 2019 fire. And one of the points around restoring Notre Dame concerned how to replace the spire, as the one that had burned was a much later addition and not even 200 years old. And I mean, here we can see in this image from around 1850, before the spire was added. So it's a more modern addition. The decision was ultimately made to keep it, and Notre Dame's restoration was completed in 2024 with the spire rebuilt. And these structures are just a few examples of how, in the 19th century, the medieval period seemingly provided a stable refuge in traditional ideals in a world that is quickly changing through industrialization, urbanization, and upheavals in political and religious institutions. Many Europeans came to seek their distinctive national origins in the medieval period, and that includes language, culture, ethics, and religion, as well as national founding myths. The chivalric revival that took place across Europe in the 19th century also considered the medieval period as the origin of European nations' martial traditions, which drew heavily on certain battles and heroes. The celebration of an idealized medieval past was really a trend across Europe. In Britain, this is exemplified by buildings such as the Palace of Westminster, built in the mid-19th century in the medievalist Gothic style. And now we have this 1850s statue of King Richard the Lionheart out front in the parking lot now. The expansion of Windsor Castle in the 1850s is another example, especially the round tower. We can see in the earlier painting from the 1760s on the top left what it looked like kind of in the early 19th century. And then in the mid-19th century, the tower is kind of renovated and greatly expanded. In the mid-19th century also, the Tower of London kind of becomes a major tourist destination. The tower and its surrounding buildings were renovated in a medievalist style to suit the fashion of the time, with battlements added to many structures. The Waterloo Block, which people might be familiar with, is built in 1845, and it's an excellent example of this. We can see with all the kind of turrets and crenellations. And this martial aspect of medievalism is important not only in kind of intra-European conflicts, but it's also at the heart of the imperialist push. As I mentioned at the start, soldiers and colonial administrators drew on an idealized martial and crusader past as they imposed Western ideals of Christianity and civilization upon colonized societies. And this same ideology is picked up in Europe's current and former settler colonies. And although Britain is one of the most significant countries in the development of medievalism, especially through this Victorian chivalric revival, in this talk, I'm going to focus a bit more on the spread of these ideals across other parts of the world. One prominent example of this was the United States, where Ivanhoe and Sir Walter Scott's other knightly tales were credited with defining Southern society before the American Civil War. Some people have gone so far as to blame Scott for causing the Civil War. Might be going a bit far. But then in 1888, we see Mark Twain satirizing the proliferation of medieval themes in his book, A Yankee at the Court of King Arthur, which is a wonderful read if you haven't come across it before. The medieval could also be seen in art and architecture, with countless universities being built in the collegiate Gothic style, reminiscent of Oxford and Cambridge, as we can see here at the University of Pennsylvania. Similarly, in cities across America, National Guard armories were built to resemble European castles, bringing together medieval symbolism with the modern military, as National Guardsmen in New York and other cities saw themselves as members of a noble elite. In the US, as elsewhere, Gothic architecture came to represent not only tradition, but also power and authority, as seen in countless prison designs that combine the modernity of the panopticon with medievalist elements, as is evident here in the central prison in Lisbon, in Portugal. Medievalism went beyond architecture, however. The popularity of knightly tales was complemented by art and literature that celebrated medieval themes, such as the works of the Russian artist Viktor Vasnetsov, who painted this here, The Knight at the Crossroads in 1878. This is just one of many medievalist paintings that he did. European medieval symbols traveled widely, and this kind of imagery of St. George and the dragon was used by all sides in the 1910s. Propaganda posters in the First World War portrayed the Americans as knights come to the rescue. After 1918, First World War memorials used chivalric imagery. And then in the 20s and 30s, fascist governments in Germany and Italy rebuilt and made use of medieval castles. We have there in Italy the Rocca delle Caminate, and on the right the Wewelsburg. The Wewelsburg actually being rebuilt using concentration camp labor from a medieval ruin. Military aspects were a key element of medievalism, and it was often related to war, empire, and commemoration. And while these martial aspects are kind of the focus of my current research and also talk today, it's important to note that medievalism was very widespread, and it was also used for what we would consider progressive causes, such as the International Knights of Labor pushing for workers' rights, or the women's suffrage movement invoking Joan of Arc. In order to understand the complex development of Western medievalism, it's important to see it in a global perspective that accounts for its entangled histories with other medievalisms and ideologies, and Japan is especially significant in this regard. And in looking at the transition in understandings and the development of Japanese medievalism, I'd like to start by looking at the legacy of samurai and castles in the modern period. Now, today, samurai and castles are among the most recognizable Japanese icons worldwide. I mean, they feature prominently in popular culture, from video games to animation. They're important tourist draws, such as here, part of a visitor campaign in Shimane Prefecture at Matsue Castle. Ignore the ninja on the left. You're not supposed to be able to see them anyway. Samurai and castles, now they're seen as ancient carriers of Japanese culture and kind of symbols of enduring traditions. They are both martial symbols most strongly associated with the medieval period, and they continue to define views of Japan at home and abroad, kind of in the popular mind. In spite of their current prominence, however, both samurai and castles were widely rejected after the Meiji Restoration of 1868 as outdated feudal relics, as Japan looked towards new Western ideals of civilization and enlightenment, or Bunmei Kaika. By the 1890s, however, samurai and castles were being rediscovered in a very modern way as tools for the creation of a Japanese national identity, supposedly grounded in ancient ideals. And what we see here in this woodblock print is the Imperial Japanese Army training in Nagoya Castle in the 1890s. And at the top right, you can see the castle keep of Nagoya Castle. It's significant that the founding of the modern Japanese nation state in 1868 essentially took place at a similar time to that of Italy in 1861 and Germany in 1871. And as elsewhere, Japanese history was rediscovered and recast to create a modern national identity based on idealized medieval martial ideals. Now, although the Tokugawa shoguns before this had presided over a period of peace, the state under the Tokugawa was organized along military lines, with massive castles at the center of Japanese cities. Now, I know that the Osaka Castle Keep shown here is a 1930s concrete reconstruction, only a few decades older than the modern skyscrapers in the background, but it serves to illustrate the scale of castles in Japanese cities. Japanese castles, as we know them today, originated in the warfare of the late 16th century, and they were certainly related to the spread of firearms from Europe. When it came to power, the Tokugawa shogunate then tightly regulated the construction or alteration of castles by the other lords in Japan. Like samurai and their swords, castles evolved little during the Tokugawa peace during these 250 years, and they were primarily symbols of power and authority. Militarily, castles served little practical purpose by the start of the 17th century. Many of them fell into disrepair. They burned down through lightning strikes or accidents, or they were destroyed by earthquakes or other phenomena common in Japan. The stability of this Tokugawa order is finally shaken in the 1850s when an American fleet begins the process of opening Japan. The inability of the samurai government to face these foreign threats leads to its collapse in 1868 following a very brief civil war. And although the later popular image of Japan would indicate that the country is filled with massive fortresses, just filled with fearlessly loyal warriors who would choose death over surrender, the course of the Civil War challenges this myth. The vast majority of castles surrendered with little or no resistance, and the war was over quite quickly, especially if we compare it with the US Civil War of the same decade. The bloodless surrender of Edo Castle by the shogunate is representative of the conflict. The new government then placed the Meiji emperor in power after 6 centuries of samurai rule had rendered emperors little more than figureheads in the eyes of most people. In spite of being kind of an ostensible return to tradition, kind of the Meiji restoration, the beginning of the Meiji period was defined by wholesale modernization and westernization processes that shook the whole country. Castles also suffered a similar fate in the early Meiji period. After centuries of neglect, there were about 60 surviving keeps in Japan when the Meiji Emperor came to power. Like samurai, castles were widely viewed as unpleasant and embarrassing reminders of the feudal past. Both regional authorities and the central government were eager to get rid of the obsolete castles, and they saw this as an opportunity to finally tear them down. All 3 of these photos are of castles that were destroyed by the mid-1870s, so this is all we've got from them now. The largest and strategically most important castles were then given over to the new imperial army, but the vast majority were given to the finance ministry for disposal. They were typically taken apart for their materials or to build schools, administrative buildings, or other more useful structures in their place. Here we can see the keep of Odawara Castle being dismantled. Whenever possible, the salvage rights to the structures were sold to make money. You can see how carefully this was kind of being taken apart and people taking the lumber elsewhere. Here, and as an example, this is Nihonmatsu up in northeastern Japan. You can see the buildings have been taken down, and you've got a modern Western-style building there on top of the ramparts. This is Matsue Castle, which was the photo I showed earlier in Shimane Prefecture with the samurai ninja in front of it. You can see the castle keep at the top right in the background, but the other outbuildings have all been torn down and replaced here with a Western-style prefectural office. Some of the larger keeps, and Matsue is one of them, essentially survived just due to the expense and danger of tearing them down. These are huge structures. One of these that lucked out was Himeji Castle. You can see the keep up there in the back left. What you see in the foreground are military barracks, because Himeji Castle became a huge military base. The plan was actually to burn the keep down and then salvage the metal from the ashes because the metal was actually worth something. This was then decided to be too dangerous, fire risk, so it didn't happen, which is a good thing because Himeji Castle then becomes one of Japan's first UNESCO World Heritage Sites in the 1990s. But in contrast to this kind of attitude towards castles, these kind of embarrassing reminders of the past, Western visitors to Japan were fascinated by Japanese castles. They recognize castles from the European context, and they're also influenced by these medievalist ideals that they kind of absorbed at home. At the same time, many Japanese delegations and officials who traveled to Europe visited castles wherever they went. The famous Iwakura mission, a high-level government delegation that travels to the West in 1871 to 73, visited dozens of castles across Europe. The Iwakura mission record is just full of castle visits. They went to dozens of castles just in the UK. They also encountered modern Gothic architecture, such as the Smithsonian Museum Castle in Washington, D.C., which was completed in the 1850s. Many Japanese accounts mention the Tower of London. Kume Kunitake, the official chronicler of the Iwakura mission, admired the tower's armory with, quote, a huge array of old armor and weapons, each item labeled with its date. There was a breech-loading gun made 300 years ago, which was a great rarity. However, Kume was decidedly less impressed by, quote, a set of Japanese armor said to have been sent from Japan as a gift to King James I. There was also a collection of Japanese swords, but they were inferior pieces of the kind found in any antique shop and not worth looking at. So Kume and other Japanese visitors were fascinated by the idea of turning an obsolete castle into a military museum for exhibiting the nation's great victories and historic weapons. This was seen as a useful tool to promote nationalism and a martial spirit, and the derelict Nagoya Castle was saved from demolition and preserved with the aim of converting it into a Japanese equivalent of the Tower of London, but obviously with much better swords. Now, Societies the world over have long collected valuable, beautiful, and famous weapons, and Japan is no exception here, with various warlords collecting armor and swords, especially, and even commissioning decorative rather than practical pieces for their collections. But what is new in the 19th century is the notion that these objects could be placed into a national historical narrative and used to educate citizens about the great military deeds of the past. And in this context, perhaps the most important sites were the arsenals and military museums of Europe, including the Tower of London. The Iwakura mission visited countless arsenals and museums, including the Great Military Museum of Vienna, which was only opened to the public in 1872, so right when the Iwakura mission is visiting. And if military museums weren't in actual historic castles, such as the Tower of London, they were often built to resemble them, as was the case in the Arsenal and the Royal Weapons Museum, which is now the Heeresgeschichtliches Museum in Vienna. And when the mission then returns to Japan, its leaders sought to implement many of the things they had deemed useful in the West. And this included a national military museum, which they built in Tokyo in 1881 in the style of a European castle, and designed by an Italian architect. This building was called the Yushukan, and the military museum remains one of the most famous sites in Japan, even if the building changed to more distinctively Japanese architectural style in the 1930s. The original Italian Yushukan building collapsed in the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake. It's located on the grounds of the Yasukuni Shrine to the War Dead, and which is one of the most popular tourist sites in Japan today. The connection between castles and the modern military can still be seen many different places today. For example, we can see it right here in Norwich, where the Regimental Museum is located inside the castle. I've seen it on previous visits. I think it's closed at the moment. But the same goes for places like Edinburgh Castle, the Tower of London. I mean, the Regimental Museum is right next to Clifford's Tower in York, and many other locations. So, even in this country, it's a very close connection. And now the narrative I've discussed so far has focused largely on Japanese responses to European medievalism. But this is only one part of the complex dynamics of global medievalism from the mid-19th century onward. And certainly this trend towards medievalism originated in Europe, and its spread was aided through imperialism, colonialism, and the spread of European technology, institution, culture, and languages. But at the same time, this is not merely a narrative of an Asian response to Western ideas. Over the last 150 years, medievalism has been transmitted, transformed, and reinterpreted within and across national boundaries. There were multiple influences on the development of medievalism in any society, and new medievalisms also made the journey back to Europe, which we can see especially in the case of the samurai. Now, by the late 1880s, Japanese attitudes towards the past had begun to shift, and part of this is generational, as memories of the Tokugawa period had dulled in the previous 20 years. Most Japanese no longer had meaningful memories of the samurai order. At the same time, Western fascination with all things Japanese extended to samurai swords and armor, which were purchased in large quantities by collectors. One example here is Prince Henry of Bourbon-Parma, Count of Bardi, who traveled to Asia in the late 1880s and bought more than 3,000 objects that he shipped back to Italy, where they are now the core of the collection of the Oriental Art Museum in Venice. Japanese objects are one of the most prominent parts of the collection, including many samurai armors and weapons. These are two paintings of himself that Henry had made while he was in Japan that are now in the collection. Also in Italy, around the same time in Florence, the Anglo-Italian businessman Frederick Stibbert added almost 100 samurai armors to his vast collection of medieval European weapons, and these are now displayed in one of the medievalist great halls that he had built for this purpose. And for anyone that's interested, I really recommend a visit to the Stibbert Museum in Florence, if only to see the gold octopus helmet that may be my favorite samurai object anywhere. Now, in the 1880s, as Westerners were collecting Japanese swords and armor, there was still extensive criticism of the samurai back in Japan. In textual sources, this negative view remained strong until the 1890s. However, the appreciation of material culture and art based around the samurai, as well as their rising profile in the West, combined with the passage of time to make possible a symbolic rehabilitation of the samurai and other feudal symbols inspired by developments throughout the Western world. And this transition can be seen specifically in the reinvention of the concept of Bushido, or the way of the samurai, the way of the warrior, which certain thinkers exhumed from forgotten texts and proposed as a native Japanese equivalent of English gentlemanship specifically. Around 1890, Japanese intellectuals cited the Victorian view that traced English gentlemanship back to medieval chivalry, and they proposed that, like England, Japan had also had a feudal knighthood, the samurai, which would serve as a reference for a native gentlemanship. They called this ethic the way of the samurai, or Bushido. And I mean, Bushido is a really obscure term before this, but it soon becomes a household word in Japan and around the world. And one of the key figures in this process of reinvention of the samurai writes in 1891, "If Japan desires to create a civilizational heaven, we should not discard Bushido even for a day. In England, they are called gentlemen. Here, they are called bushi or samurai. Although the terms are different, they are ultimately the same. In English, gentlemanly and ungentlemanly are two words that determine the failure or success of a man. In our country, being labeled with the word bushi should have the same force." So while he's holding up the English gentleman holding them up as the best role model, he's arguing that Japanese samurai are in no way inferior. Unfortunately, he points out samurai ethics had been neglected, but through a concerted effort at their revival, Japan could be successful on the international stage. And this reinvention of the samurai that begins in the late 1880s is directly inspired by the Victorian chivalric revival, as we can see in this quote. And this is also because the education of Japanese in the Meiji period relies very heavily on the many British and American world history textbooks that are being translated from English into Japanese, and in which the Middle Ages and chivalry play a very important role. So you can see this from a Japanese book. This is actually early 20th century, with a lot of things like this. And at the top, it says Seiyo Bushito Shukyo, so, Western knights, Western warriors, and religion. Now, many Japanese writers are heavily influenced by idealized notions of English gentlemanship as the basis for the strength of the British Empire, and they typically accept the links that were drawn between medieval knights and modern gentlemen. These dynamics contributed to Bushido becoming a household word in Japan and around the world by the turn of the 20th century. I mean, Bushido is portrayed as an ethic of honesty, integrity, and frugality, similar to the values of an idealized English gentleman. And, this is really part of this process by which people in Japan rediscover their own medieval past as a source for a modern national identity. The wholesale demolition of castles also stops. The first kind of moves towards the preservation of castles begins, even as dozens more castles are converted to modern army bases here in Hiroshima. You can see some of the castle buildings there on the right, the top right. But through castles and Bushido, medievalist symbols were linked to the modern state, and especially the modern military that is seen as the heirs of the samurai warriors. This connection develops rapidly after victory in the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, and it also changes significantly at this time. As an ethic based on the samurai warriors, the martial elements of Bushido were brought to the fore after the Sino-Japanese War, and there's a new Bushido which focuses on self-sacrifice, patriotism, and love for the emperor. Bushido became a key pillar of the emperor-centered state ideology during and after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, and it fulfills this role until the end of the Second World War. Now, historians of the Victorian chivalric revival have argued that chivalry died in the trenches of the First World War, when mechanized warfare and poison gas put paid to fantasies of knightly duels and the romance of the battlefield. In Japan as well, popular interest in Bushido and the samurai declined from around 1914, but they then experienced a resurgence in the militaristic propaganda of the 1930s. Having attained global recognition, however, popular interest in Bushido and the samurai essentially, it's still very much there. But before and during the Second World War there, in those 15 years, the samurai became symbols of Japanese strength in the countries allied with Japan, as we can see in the materials from Germany and Italy here. So we can see on the left, this is an Italian propaganda poster by Gino Boccasile, and we have this giant samurai there striding the ocean, and he's about to smash British and American ships. And I mean, this is from, I believe, January 1942, so a little bit after Pearl Harbor. When you actually look at the armor a bit more closely in some of it, you kind of realize that he probably hasn't actually seen a lot of samurai armor. I'm not sure about kind of the McDonald's golden arches thing on the helmet. I haven't actually seen one of those. Then on the left there, or on the right, sorry, we've got a German kind of image from the mid 1930s, and we see this kind of Germanic knight there. It's very much a Wehrmacht helmet that he's wearing. And then on the right, we see kind of the samurai, and then we see the Comintern, the communist serpent, and the line below it, essentially the description says, not over our threshold, not across our threshold. So real use of this in the countries that are allied with Japan. Conversely, the countries that were at war with Japan also saw the samurai as evidence of Japan's supposedly militaristic nature. And we can see that here in cartoons from Punch magazine from 1939 and 1942. So the one on the left is around the time of the Tianjin incident, and it depicts negotiations. We've got John Bull sitting there and trying to negotiate with the Japanese negotiator who is, jumping around on the table with a sword and in samurai armor. On the right, the eagle and the pirate is the caption, and we see this kind of samurai there with his sword in the boat, and then this American eagle. You can see the stars and stripes on the wings. So this is what Punch is kind of presenting in the late 30s and early 40s. Now, the use of samurai imagery by Japan's enemies in the Second World War was most pronounced in the United States. And the focus on the samurai was even more pronounced in American propaganda than it was in Japanese materials. And kind of the disconnect between Japanese and American views can be seen in the propaganda film Know Your Enemy, Japan, which was commissioned by the US War Department and produced under the direction of the famous Hollywood director Frank Capra. And although the film was ultimately only completed at the end of the war, its content is quite significant. And Capra edits together actual Japanese propaganda films in this. It's about an hour-long film. He edits together actual Japanese propaganda films to supposedly show how Japanese thought and acted when these materials, in fact, merely reflected how the Japanese government desired that its citizens would feel and behave. Now, much of the focus was on emperor worship and the modern military, as well as civilians doing military drill. And at the same time, Know Your Enemy Japan includes a substantial amount of samurai-related content that reflects American expectations more than Japanese realities. So, we can see things like this, and it's kind of giving us a potted history of Japan with all of these warriors fighting over the islands until, the biggest warrior ends up winning and taking over. We have all this footage coming here, kind of samurai processions, warlords, kind of there getting ready for battle, and then actual kind of fights and all of these things going on. And significantly, this footage is either in the propaganda film, it's either newly created or it's taken from popular samurai films rather than Japanese propaganda materials. Because Japanese propaganda materials actually do not feature as much samurai content and imagery as the American filmmakers and government wanted and expected. These are just a few stills of the film. The whole thing is on YouTube if you want to watch it. It's a really interesting piece. But one of the things, as kind of suggested in this still, you've seen there's a mix here of live action things from samurai films and also some animated footage and something that's been constructed. And you can see here in this still, one of the main aims of the film is to show the samurai spirit that is supposedly behind the modern Japanese soldier. And as the narrator says later in the film over footage of a sword being forged, quote, as the steel is shaped by beating and hammering, so the boy is beaten and hammered into the shape of the fanatic samurai. And Capra's use of different types of media, including both official propaganda films and popular period films, suggests that during the Second World War, samurai symbolism is in some ways more important to Japan's enemies than it was to the Japanese government or people. And the animated sequences, such as this slide, were most likely made by Capra's team, as they would have really struggled to find Japanese images that combined the samurai with the imperial army in the way the Americans were expecting. Similarly, that image earlier, that poster made by an Italian of a giant Japanese samurai smashing battleships, I've never seen anything like that produced by kind of Japanese artists at that time. Now, after Japan's surrender in August 1945, many people in Japan understandably rejected the samurai as symbols of the nation, and Japan looked forward towards a peaceful democratic future, albeit under the US nuclear umbrella. During the US occupation of Japan that lasted until 1952, symbols of militarism, such as samurai films and martial arts, were banned, while tons of samurai-style swords produced by the military in the 1930s and 1940s were sunk in Tokyo Bay by the Americans. Many other swords made their way to museums and private collections as souvenirs taken by Allied soldiers. There are also examples here in Norwich actually, at the Royal Norfolk Regimental Museum. At the same time, samurai swords and armor were also increasingly classed as works of art and thereby protected from destruction. Some prominent items were moved from the Yushukan Military Museum, which was closed by the American authorities, to the Tokyo National Museum. I haven't been able to trace exactly how this transfer happened, but I have images of these things in the Yushukan in the pre-war period, and now I can see them in the Tokyo National Museum collection. And there's no mention of this in kind of the public catalog on this. Meanwhile, Japan's distant samurai past came to be seen as a place of refuge and escape for a country coming to terms with defeat and occupation in the 1950s. The pre-modern warriors seemed to offer an alternative masculinity that was safely removed from the excesses of the imperial state that collapsed in 1945. And this shift could also clearly be seen in post-war architecture, as the US Army had decreed soon after the war that castles and other military areas be demilitarized and should now house schools, universities, parks, and cultural institutions. Having gained control over their castles from the military, local authorities immediately began to plan their future. For those cities that had lost their castle keeps in the war, reconstruction was seen as an important symbolic step in their post-war recovery. Other cities, which had lost their keeps in the 1870s or even before, were similarly enthusiastic to rebuild their keeps. Not wanting to be left out, many cities that had never had keeps at any point in history decided that this was clearly a case of better late than never and joined the castle building boom. The 1950s and 1960s saw an unprecedented flurry of castle construction, all of which was done from steel reinforced concrete, and most of which was done with little regard to historical accuracy. Also in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a rapid growth in samurai films, most famously the works of Akira Kurosawa. Films such as Seven Samurai and Yojimbo received critical acclaim and global success. In many of these films, the figure of the samurai was a much more nuanced figure than in more kind of idealistic pre-war tales. The samurai were often troubled and problematic figures with little loyalty and often without lords, living in a violent age. These figures resonated not only with Japanese audiences in the early post-war years, but also with people in many other countries. Samurai films directly inspired many so-called spaghetti westerns produced in the 1960s, transplanting the narratives from Japan to the American West, from samurai to cowboys. In this way, Seven Samurai became the Magnificent Seven, while Yojimbo was reinvented as a fistful of dollars. The inspiration wasn't limited to westerns, however. Kurosawa's 1958 film, The Hidden Fortress, stars Toshio Mifune as a lone samurai being escorted on his mission by two bumbling peasants. Almost 2 decades later, in 1977, The Hidden Fortress inspires another film with a very similar theme, set in a somewhat different context. The bumbling peasants became droids, and swords became lightsabers, while the designs of helmets, uniforms, and other aspects of the Star Wars universe were modeled on samurai, Darth Vader being perhaps the most prominent example. In the 1980s, then, Bushido and the samurai experienced another, more lasting popular revival, this time centered around the theories of Nitobe Inazo, a Japanese Quaker who had written perhaps the most famous book on the subject, Bushido, the Soul of Japan, in 1900. Although Nitobe's Bushido theories were relatively minor before 1945, Its universality made it well suited as a potential vehicle for cross-cultural understanding in the more peaceful and internationalist atmosphere of 1980s Japan. Nitobe himself was Undersecretary of the League of Nations after the First World War and a famous internationalist and diplomat, and his appearance on the 5,000 yen note from 1984 onward sparked renewed interest in his work. This rediscovery of Nitobe tied in with Japan's tremendous economic success in the 1970s and 1980s, which led both Japanese and foreigners to seek cultural explanations for this miracle, and Bushido was held up as a possible model. Theories drawing similarities between modern companies and traditional warrior houses, or modern workers and samurai, abounded, and books with titles such as The Way of the Warrior Trader, American Samurai, The Code of the Executive, Samurai Management filled the shelves. I mean, there's even a German version there on The Samurai Salesman, The 7 Ways of the Warrior in Merciless Competition. Now, more recently, as Japanese popular culture in the form of video games, manga, anime, films, and other media has become mainstream around the world, the samurai have become a truly global icon. And here it's important to note that much of the samurai content consumed around the world today is not actually produced in Japan, but in many other countries. Certainly, Japanese companies like Nintendo and Sony still produce samurai games. Japanese film studios still create many samurai films. But some of the top titles of the last 20 years have actually been created by multinational teams, often based in North America or Europe. I mean, James Clavell's Shogun is an early example of this, and it was recently remade by a US studio. A major milestone in all of this was a 2003 blockbuster, The Last Samurai. And for those of you who can read Japanese, you can see the word Bushido written along the sides next to kind of framing Tom Cruise there. Just last year, major samurai video games, including Ghost of Yote, the sequel to the highly acclaimed Ghost of Tsushima, appeared. Both of these were made by an American studio. Another blockbuster game was Assassin's Creed Shadows, made by a French studio. As countless cultural products show, the samurai has become a truly global icon. At the same time, the way samurai are portrayed and received often tells us much more about today's societies than it does about the historical samurai. This can be seen, for example, in the fierce online debates around Assassin's Creed and the fact that the playable characters are a black samurai and a woman ninja, which was quite controversial. One area where the influence of medievalism on the samurai legacy maintains particularly strong is in the collection and display of objects. In Japan, many reconstructed castles now host local history museums with extensive displays of original swords and armor. I mean, even older keeps, such as here at Matsuyama, often have displays of this type. Many of the swords date from the medieval period, and although the vast majority of surviving armors are from the 18th and 19th centuries, they were produced and collected with a nostalgia for earlier periods in mind, and often made to recreate medieval styles. This was then enhanced by modern collection practices in the Meiji period, when many armors were sold to foreigners, even as Japan was in the process of inventing and reinventing its own medieval past. And the legacy of this fascination with the samurai in the West is evident in countless museums around the world, and I'm always intrigued when I stumble across a samurai armor in an unexpected place, such as the local history museum in Keighley in West Yorkshire, which currently has a fascinating exhibition of samurai objects collected by local industrialists, especially mill owners who were active trading in Japan. At Snows Hill Manor, a National Trust property in Gloucestershire, the eccentric collector Charles Paget Wade gathered several dozen suits of samurai armor from around the UK in the 1930s and 1940s, when tensions with Japan were high and these things were quite cheap to acquire. Oftentimes, samurai armors are juxtaposed with European ones, especially in large public collections. As one enters the armor displays in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the main gallery is dedicated to European armor, as is the side gallery on the left. On the right, however, the other side gallery is dedicated largely to Japanese armors, reflecting the prominence of the samurai in the Western imagination. In many cases, Japan is held up as the non-Western counterpart to illustrate the universality of the European medieval experience, which I would argue that this is more of a reflection of the influence of medievalism on collecting and display practices. Similarly, the vast collection of the Imperial Armory in Vienna also includes samurai armors, both in its main museum in Vienna and in Castle Ambras near Innsbruck. As many of you will know, and as Simon mentioned, next month there will be a major exhibition on the samurai opening at the British Museum. And we've been working on this, Rosina Buckland and I, for the last 5 years. And this exhibition draws on samurai-related objects from around the world and across hundreds of years. And we've been very conscious of this influence of medievalism, nostalgia, idealization, and myth-making on the production, circulation, collection, and curation of samurai objects throughout their history. And many of these, I mean, are really truly amazing pieces. And in addition to admiring their craftsmanship, kind of materials and functions, it's often interesting to consider when and why things were made and how they got where they are today. And as I've tried to kind of show in this talk, medievalism has been a significant current in modern Japan and really a key influence on the development of the samurai into a global icon. So, thank you.
Well, Oleg, thank you very much indeed. What a wonderful talk, and I think you've got us all. We'll be queuing up, I think, to come down to the British Museum to see the exhibition that you've been working so hard on. Oh goodness, there's so many. The comparisons I think you've been drawing between what's been happening around the world and in Japan, and the fact that I hadn't even thought about the Iwakura mission being influenced by this sort of medievalism that they were seeing in Europe and the States, and then taking that back to Japan. And I also hadn't realized that so many of the castles that you see these days in Japan are actually made in the 1960s and 1970s. That's really intriguing. Although I do know there's all sorts of debates, I think, at the moment around Nagoya Castle and the reconstruction of that, and to what extent you can build an authentic castle. I suppose I know that debates that were perhaps reminiscent of that were echoing around the walls of Norwich Castle over the last 7 years, while we've been trying to get that back to some kind of authentic state for understanding the medieval period as well. So a talk with many, many fascinating resonances, I think. So, opening it up, if we may, does anybody in the room have any questions for our speaker? Lady just here.
Thank you very much for your talk. It is obvious, of course, and you also showed it in your wonderful lecture, that samurai and everything kind of related to samurai has become sort of the symbol of Japanese medievalism. But I'm curious about other symbols of Japanese medievalism, and particularly one thing that you mentioned in your talk is the pirate. In that wonderful caricature from the Punch, right? The eagle and the Japanese pirate. Were Japanese pirates also kind of part of this interest for Japanese Middle Ages? Or can you just tell us more about the story and in general on other medieval symbols? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think this one, coming from kind of Punch magazine, I mean, this is very much kind of a British view of this. In terms of pirates, that's a really good question. I mean, because I think we're probably most familiar with the kind of pirates in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, kind of the Wako, who, are often described as Japanese pirates, probably kind of a multi-ethnic group kind of active in that part of the world. I think those are probably used a bit more in the late 19th, early 20th centuries in terms of kind of justifying imperial expansion, I would guess. I don't know a lot about this myself, so I'm speculating based on other things, because this is one of the things we see. There are quite a lot of kind of samurai, but also a lot of Japanese merchants who go to Southeast Asia in the 16th century, into what's now Thailand, in the Philippines, other places. And they're often kind of used as mercenaries in these places. They're seen as, Japanese are seen as being these kind of great warriors. And then there is, in the late 19th century, kind of a rediscovery of many of these figures as Japan is kind of rebuilding links with the rest of Asia and Southeast Asia. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there might be kind of attempt to kind of resurrect some of that kind of pirate legacy as well. But I think that's probably detached from this. I'm not exactly sure what the Punch cartoonist was looking at. Yeah, so I think it's interesting when you look at, because I've gone through all the Punch magazines, everything I could find from late 1890s, I think, and it's interesting because the the samurai only kind of becomes a symbol of Japan in Punch around 1910 or so. Before that, it's more often the emperor or some other kind of deities or other figures, and then it becomes the samurai. And the samurai armors become more and more accurate. So by this point, the samurai armors and things look quite accurate. I mean, the Italian was a little less accurate in terms of the details, but I mean, Punch magazine artists were actually quite accurate by that point. So the way by which the samurai becomes a symbol of Japan rather than, say, the emperor or some other things is quite significant. Yeah.
Eugenia.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk and really interesting and thought-provoking ideas and visuals as well. I have a question about the Second World War, then the usage of the image of samurai in Japan and outside of Japan. As you mentioned, it was more common to be referencing samurai visually outside of Japan. Do you have a reason for that? Do you know why in Japan that was not the preference? Or what was the relationship with that image in Japan during the war?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. I mean, so there's a couple of issues, and one of them, I mean, I think I mentioned earlier on when there was that little note at the bottom. Feel free to ask me how these differ, because Bushido could be translated either way. And the thing is, if you translate as the way of the samurai, I mean, the samurai are a historical kind of class, and that exists for a certain period. And whether or not the term samurai is used is another issue, but if you move away from that and you call it the way of the warrior, then you can suddenly include ancient mythical warrior emperors and deities and other things which aren't specifically the social class of the samurai. And that gets to one of the tensions you have between the samurai and the imperial house, because from 1868 until 1945, Japan is really focused on the emperor and the imperial house. But the samurai are famously kind of disloyal to the imperial house, if anything. And that tension is really hard to resolve. There are a few examples. So the one example that always gets brought up is the 14th century warrior Kusunoki Masashige. And that there's a big statue of him in front of the imperial palace in Tokyo, which is there around 1900. And that's one of the few statues that's not melted down in the Second World War for its metal. And that's still there. But Kusunoki Masashige was in the 1330s, is famous. I mean, a lot of this is mythologized, but he was best known for being loyal to the Emperor Go-Daigo. And he is one of the few kind of samurai who demonstrated this real imperial loyalty, and he kind of dies in the service of the emperor. But there are very few examples they can draw on here. So there is this real tension with how do you use these historical warriors who were not actually loyal to the emperor or didn't talk about the emperor with this modern ideology. And Sven Sala at Sophia University in Tokyo has written an excellent forthcoming article on this. He went through a lot of Japanese military materials from that period. And like I went through a lot of these materials and I was looking for Bushido and samurai. So, that's what I was kind of focusing on, whereas Sven was just kind of looking at proportions. And he says, actually, there's a lot more focus on the emperor. There's a lot more focus on other things. And actually, the samurai aren't as important as one might think. And that was one of the things that got me thinking a bit more relative to Western propaganda, if it's German, Italian, British, or American. I'm now fairly convinced that the samurai are actually probably relatively more important to Japan's allies and enemies than they are within Japan. And that may or may not even be true today. So, thanks.
Oleg. Thanks, Oleg. I just had to ask this question after the talk. Because if you read the 1930s Soviet, not necessarily only propaganda, but anything written about the Japanese, you will lose count of the word samurai. So much so that, for example, in the late 1940s, during the very brief war between the two countries, almost every memoir written by any soldiers who ever saw a Japanese either has in the title has the word samurai, or I have fought with those damned samurai. So I don't know how much of this is a question, how much of a question this is, or a comment. Also the word pirate, because wako in Japanese what Japanese bandit, but also in the old kind of medieval Chinese meaning means like dwarf bandits, which was which was a term which was widely used, as you know, during the War of Resistance against Japan by the China, both the CCP and the KMT. So I guess the question here is kind of echoing what Eugenia said. Somehow samurai becomes this very convenient symbol for the enemies. I mean more enemies, as well as the allies, or as well as the people who are fascinated by Japan. And somehow samurai gathers all the good and the bad about Japan, and which is kind of very skillfully then used in propaganda, or in even sometimes just venting some anger against the Japanese. They use the term samurai. So thank you.
No, that's wonderful. Yeah, thanks so much for the comment, because I mean, that's really interesting to hear about kind of the ordinary soldier. So one of the things we've been doing, we always got the British Museum exhibition, and we've got the book is out, but we've also been running kind of a big parallel research project, and we've got over 20 kind of scholars from around the world working on this, and a lot of people working on different regions and how the samurai were used in different regions. And Tatiana Linkoeva has written an article for this. Hopefully this will come out in March, and she's also got a column in the exhibition book. But she talks about samurai in the Soviet Union and this idea. And what she has discovered is, and this is looking more kind of centrally kind of from the state, but the way the concept of samurai was used was more towards like the Japanese leadership, that it was the samurai that were at fault for all these bad things. But as one would maybe expect from the Soviet Union, it's very class focused, right? They would say, you have all the poor common Japanese, and then you have the samurai who are the kind of leadership still, and so their Bushido is being seen as problematic, and the samurai being seen as problematic. But that's not all Japanese. It's not being conflated with all Japanese. It's saying, oh no, that's the rulers. And we see similar things in some other cultures as well. And so we have a lot of people writing on a lot of different, how the samurai are used in India, for example, or in Indonesia, or in different places. And in all of these cultures, that image is really used to kind of fit almost local necessities, almost more so than what's actually going on in Japan. So that's really interesting to hear. We'll have to talk more about the diaries. Yeah.
Olivia, do we have any questions on? Oh, I thought we might do. We've got some questions online, which Olivia, I think, will read out for us.
Thank you so much. So yes, we have lots of questions online, so we'll get through as many as we can. The first question: thank you for an interesting talk. Would the garb worn by the ashigaru also now be called samurai armor?
So that's a really interesting question, because it gets to one of the issues here is around the word samurai, which we obviously use in English. And when I say samurai, we know what we kind of expect. Everyone has this image of, kind of an adult male warrior wearing armor is what people think of with two swords. That's what people think of. Obviously in the early modern periods, the samurai, it's actually, warriors, it's actually a social class. It's hereditary. That means that actually the adult male samurai is going to be less than half. It's going to be probably about half women, a lot of children. So it's much more diverse. We go before that, like the definition of a warrior before 1600 is much more in flux. The other thing is, in terms of the terminology, like samurai in Japanese, usually it changes a lot how it's used over the centuries, and it's not really ever used as kind of a catch-all term like we use it in English. The most catch-all term we kind of have is bushi, warrior, like the bushi from Bushido. But even bushi, like when we see that written in early modern texts, it often wasn't read bushi, it was read mono no fu. There's different ways of reading these characters. So there aren't really these kind of catch-all terms. You have all these little, I mean, the question asked around ashigaru, is that a samurai? In English, we'd probably call that a samurai. Depends who we're asking if that, in Japanese historians tend not to use the word samurai unless it is there in the original sources. They tend to use the word bushi. And one interesting development I've kind of noticed was because the word samurai, we see it in Western texts already, I think from probably like the 17th century a bit, and then especially in the 19th century, it becomes this catch-all term. And in Japan, there's a growing awareness that in other countries, Japanese warriors are referred to as samurai. And so the word in Japanese is used a bit more as this kind of global standard. But one thing, and those people who are familiar with Japanese will know, you can write samurai in a kanji, in a Chinese character. You can write it in hiragana, which is kind of phonetic alphabet, which is used for Japanese words. And you can also write it in katakana, which is an alphabet usually used for foreign loan words. And a shift I've discovered in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, when you do see samurai, it's usually written in hiragana, which means, it's a Japanese word, and sometimes in kanji, not so frequently. But around 1940s, especially in the 1950s onward, samurai is being written much more frequently in katakana. And now the vast majority of times you see samurai written, it's written in katakana, which to me implies that people are seeing this as almost like not a Japanese thing, but kind of this global thing that's understood. And when we're referring to samurai in katakana, that's something different from a Japanese bushi, like this historical figure. And we see it in things like the Japanese men's football national team. I mean, they're called, Samurai Blue, like Samurai Blue. Or the baseball team is, baseball team is called Samurai Japan. Yeah, I mean, and again, they're using the English word Japan. The baseball team interestingly, they use the kanji rather than katakana, but that's also something around baseball and traditionalism. So they use the English word Japan, but then they use a kanji. But there's an interesting thing that I think in Japan now, when you see samurai written, it is very often as almost like as a foreign kind of international concept, I think.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. Next question is, to what extent was Japanese foreign policy and expansion between 1900 and the 1930s actually driven by this medieval warrior culture?
I mean, I don't know to what extent anything is driven by it. I think it's convenient. It's utilized. We see it in education. We see it in like moral education in schools. We do see it in military textbooks, mainly for the officers, not so much for kind of enlisted men. It's there, but I think it'd be a stretch to say it's really driving the expansion. I mean, people might be utilizing it for that, certainly, but whether I think the Americans, for example, would think that that's what's driving it. An American or maybe a British preconception of Japan at the time would make them think, oh, Japan is behaving this way because they're all samurai. But I don't think that's what people in Japan would be thinking. So.
Great, thank you. Should I do more? So the next question, thank you for a fascinating talk. The construction of new medievalism seems to have been, to a large extent, an exercise in cherry picking from the past to suit the purposes of the present. In this regard, could you comment on aspects of Japan's Chusei samurai culture that were intentionally left out in constructing an idealized medieval past in Japan?
Oh, there's so many examples. There's a wonderful article by Carl Friday titled Bushido or Bull from the early 1990s. And Friday's kind of leading kind of historian of medieval Japan. And he essentially looked at, what is seen as Bushido in the early 1990s and then looking, and he's like, this has nothing to do with what I'm seeing here in the medieval period. One of the big things that he also mentions that people bring up is kind of this idea of loyalty, which, in the late 19th century, when kind of Bushido is reinvented, a lot of the emphasis is on loyalty, especially to the emperor. As I mentioned, that's not really a samurai thing. But this concept of loyalty, it was much more fluid and less idealized. I mean, a lot of the relationships that warriors had were very much reciprocal, transactional. I will go and fight for you in exchange for these things. And some of the best records we have for medieval samurai are actually essentially receipts, when they went out to battle and they would come back and they had the receipts saying, look, I lost this many men and I killed this many, I took this many heads, and therefore I should get, land or whatever else. And so, it's much more transactional than this, I think, what we kind of think in this idealized term. So that'd be one of the things, but really I would look at something like, Carl Friday's, Bushido or Bull or something like that. There's quite a few works out there.
I have a question, if I may. I've been really intrigued. We had a talk about pirates, in fact, in November from Michel Zamian, and we tried to key it in a little bit to the exhibition at the National Maritime Museum on pirates at the moment, which doesn't even mention Japanese pirates at all. But one of the things that was intriguing about that exhibition was the role of women in what is largely regarded as being a sort of perhaps the stereotypes, it's more of a male activity. I'm struck that in Japan, the interest in swords these days is very much there's a female interest in swords with the Tolkien Joshi and all of this. How does that play out with ideas about samurai? Is there a gendered aspect to that perhaps we've been overlooking?
Yeah, that's a huge question, and a very important one. I mean, there are so many gendered aspects to this. I mean, obviously, not just in terms of like men and women, but obviously, the whole idea of masculinity and samurai culture, and kind of the performance of things and swords and armor and all of those things. But I think, and it's interesting now because it can be. We have these examples. We have a few examples in the exhibition of kind of famous, sometimes legendary women warriors, like Tomoe Gozen. These materials were really popular in the 19th century, kind of woodblock prints of these kind of legendary women warriors, kind of accounts of women kind of fighting. There are some, they're not many, but we do have some actual accounts. We think of someone like Nijima Yae, who is fighting at Aizu Wakamatsu in kind of the Meiji Restoration War. We do kind of have these kind of samurai women there, but I think something potentially also changes because there's the samurai status. People have talked about kind of different things around what samurai status is, and in Japan in the early modern period, and being a head of household, things like that. Like if a woman was a head of household, that was then the most important thing, rather than the fact that she was a woman. It was actually she's a head of household, and she's kind of in a lot of her interactions are that way. And I think with samurai status, that's similar. It's hard sometimes to see some of the shifts that happened in the Meiji period because it's such a cultural upheaval, and gender is one of the really useful lenses through which to kind of examine kind of the modernization and westernization of Japan. Because in some ways, what the arrival of kind of Western ideas on the large scale into Japan in the late 19th century is actually quite regressive. There are a lot of things that in Japan you would think seem to be a lot more open, and then kind of get shut down by Western ideas, which seem even more conservative. In other ways, it's quite the opposite. There's a really interesting article in the American Historical Review a couple of years ago by Sarah Tall, which is I'm trying to remember the title of it. Chivalry Without Women is what it's titled, and she examines Bushido, and it's a very focused study of Bushido around late 1890s, early 1900s, when you're getting this kind of competing definitions between a lot of Japanese thinkers who are kind of building up Bushido as a Japanese chivalry, and they're setting it as a counterpart to European chivalry. And it's much more getting more kind of nationalistic, more assertive, and trying to figure out ways in which Bushido is superior to Western chivalry. And one of the figures that I study quite a bit is a professor of philosophy at Tokyo Imperial University, Inoue Tetsujiro, who dismisses Western chivalry as mere woman worship, like Josei Suhai. And Sarah Tall essentially examines a lot of these texts to say a lot of them, and discovers that a lot of them are saying, well, this is what makes Japanese Bushido superior to Western chivalry, is that Japanese Bushido, it's not effeminate at all. Western chivalry is too focused on women. And whereas, samurai were men, and they were only with other men, and they didn't think about women at all. And so the misogyny within Bushido, according to this interpretation, is essentially what sets it apart from kind of weaker Western chivalry. And again, if one wants to, you can kind of go through earlier pre-modern sources and find things to kind of support that. But this is kind of a construction of kind of the 1890s, 1900s, and that dynamic. So, gender is very much at I mean, the heart of all of this. So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Oleg. I'm afraid we're sort of running out of time now, but thank you very much indeed once again for a fabulous talk and for engaging so enthusiastically with all of our questions. Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
that's really enjoyable again. Thank you. So there will be a recording of Oleg's talk being uploaded onto our YouTube channel over the next couple of days. And I believe it usually sits there for a week or so for anybody who wasn't able to catch it today or wants to hear it again. For our online audience, you'll see a feedback form appearing in your browser and in a follow-up email that you'll get tomorrow. And as ever, we greatly value any feedback that you can let us have, and it helps us continually improve, hopefully, our lecture series. Next month in February, and I think it's February the 19th, I want to say, but is that the right date? Yeah. We're going to welcome our own Professor of Silk Road Studies, Susan Whitfield, who's going to be speaking to us on a project which is very close to our heart at the moment, and it's on pilgrimage from Nara to Norwich. And this is partly in preparation for our public walk along the route between Norwich and Little Walsingham that we're going to be undertaking in June, a little bit later this year, and which complements the walk that Susan and our own wonderful Olivia undertook between Hasadera in Nara and the Ise Grand Shrine last November. We're hoping there'll be a few less bears on the route between Norwich to Little Walsingham, but who knows? So that is going to be another in-person talk, and I believe that will be here. And it'll be available online as well. So we very much hope you'll be able to join us for that. Our third Thursday lectures, which have been running since 2001, so this is our 25th anniversary of the third Thursday lectures, how about that, are supported by our fantastic funders, the Gatsby Charitable Foundation, the Great Britain Sasakar Foundation, and Yakult UK, and we're tremendously grateful to them for the support that allows us to deliver these talks to you. Thank you once again to Oleg and to all of you for showing up this evening despite the weather, and to those of you online. Those of you online, I'm afraid, have to forego the pleasures of the reception that we've got arranged at the back of the room, but I hope all of you who are with us will join us for a glass of sake or something and take the opportunity to talk some more to Oleg as well. But thank you very much indeed, and good night.